The work I'm going to talk about today on RII really started with the TBOTS model, which is Mike Slater and colleagues, and I'm fortunate to be one of the colleagues on that paper and helped develop that theory. And I guess it's been about 10 years ago that we published that. And TBOTS is temporary expansion of the boundaries of the self. And like I said, it forms the foundation for a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about today. And it draws heavily from self-determination theory. And self-determination theory maintains that there are three fundamental needs that human beings have that we're intrinsically motivated to fulfill. A need for autonomy, or the need to feel that we control our own lives, our own need for competence, the need to feel that we are good at things, and the need for relatedness, or the need to feel that we are valued by others. So SDT, self-determination theory, argues that these are three foundational needs that all humans have. Unfortunately, these needs are imperfectly attainable. The self is inherently confining. So for example, at the start of this, I felt both low autonomy and low competence because of what was going on with the internet. And it's beyond my control, but still it's going to impact about how I feel about myself. Also, we know from a lot of work in social psychology that the development of the self, the maintenance of the self, defense of the self concept, all of these things are very resource demanding. It takes a lot of energy to do these things. And there's going to be times when we want to escape from that and when we want to leave that alone. So we have these fundamental needs, but it's also extremely difficult to achieve these fundamental needs. As a consequence, and it's sort of depressing, but that we sort of take the position that we're nearly chronically in a state of unmet needs. Now, within TBOTS, we argue that how we deal with these unmet needs is engaging with narratives. Okay, so what we argue happens when we engage in the narratives is that we engage in boundary expansion, hence temporary expanding of the self. And we do this when we're engaged in narrative by vicariously adopting the roles or self-concepts of characters and things like that, which just allow us to escape the confines that are on us. So for example, in a story world, we can experience social roles, we can experience time periods, we can experience places in that are not possible for us as an individual, which gives us a sense of autonomy. For example, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and hopefully you guys are familiar with Lord of the Rings, but for example, I can experience what it's like to be on Middle-earth, or I could experience what it's like to be going through Mirkwood and things like that, which gives me a sense of autonomy because I'm engaging in these things through the story. Likewise, we can experience capabilities or the lack thereof that are not characterized of our own characteristics. So when I read Lord of the Rings, and I don't know how many times I've read it or watched the movies, I all at once am a competent swords person. I just love the swords play, and I can be competent at that through the narrative, identification and things like that, that normally isn't the case. Likewise, I can experience vicariously relationships with every kind and any other kind of other. So when I'm reading Lord of the Rings, I can be engaged, I can be talking with an elf, I can be walking through the forest with a hobbit, I can do all types of different things like that. And again, what we argue is that we seek out narratives because through this boundary expansion, it allows us to fulfill these intrinsic needs as identified by self-determination theory. And so essentially the idea is that we should select narratives that aid in boundary expansion. Now, when we were developing this, one of the things that kept coming back to me is something from my childhood. And when we were talking about it, and all the research that we published specifically on TBOTS, it's been where we present them with the opportunity to engage in a narrative, and we see how transported they are and things like that. But we're having them engage in the narrative. But how often do we have the situation where we can't engage in a narrative, where we can't watch a movie, where we can't read a book or so forth? So I remember back to it was the summer after Star Wars came out. And so my parents took me on this very long and very boring vacation. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan after seeing the first movie. I love Lord of the Rings. And so while sitting, and I had no autonomy, I was forced to go on this trip. They were doing a lot of looking for genealogy, so tracing our family history. I had no competence in that. And so what I did is I morphed these two worlds. So I had Luke became part of the Nine in Lord of the Rings. And for whatever reason, lightsabers made it into Middle Earth, but blasters didn't. Han Solo helped Sam and Frodo when they were in Mordor. So I morphed these two worlds, and that became a way for me to fulfill my needs, even though I wasn't directly engaged with the narrative. And I don't know why I'm going to show you a picture here, but this to me is a picture of Gandalf with a lightsaber. And it just, when I first saw this, it was like, that's what I was experiencing that summer. And trust me, Gandalf with a lightsaber is one tough cookie. The Balrog wouldn't have had a chance against Gandalf if Gandalf had had the lightsaber. But it's this notion of experiencing narratives when we're not actually engaged with the narrative. But what we've always studied is engagement in the narrative. And so Mike Slater and I talked about this a lot. And I think maybe more than anything, just to shut me up, he decided that we would go ahead and try to develop a scale. And so this was a paper we published in Media Psychology back in 2018. And this was a paper where we're developing various scales related to characters, okay? And so retrospective imaginative involvement is what we decided to call it. And it's the cognitive processing of narrative content outside of the direct exposure to it. So when we're not watching the TV show, when we're not watching the movie, when we're not reading the book, it's when we're thinking about or engaging with these narratives in those other times. And I think we all do that. But it's something that we have not really studied that much. There's been work done in cultural studies, and we'll talk about some of that, but it's been, in my view, a fairly neglected idea. And we developed an 8-item scale, and people were asked, how frequently do you engage in the following after? And we were very clear, after you've watched or read a story. So not while you're reading it, not while you're watching it, but later. And things like, imagine a TV character, or imagine a character from one show that you watch in a different reality or TV show, and things like that. Imagine what would happen if one or more of the characters in the story had made a different choice or behaved in a different way. Or imagine that one of the characters is different from the way the character is portrayed in the show. So we're asking people to engage in these, how often do you get these thoughts? Now, what we found is, we used a Qualtrics sample of a little over 1,000 people. And first of all, we found that you can measure RII, very, very reliable. The Cronbach's alpha was 0.97. The short version of the scale is just 4 items if we're doing surveys. And again, the alpha was 0.93, so very good. And I'm not going to get into any of the SEM stuff or anything like that. You can go back to the paper for that. And it correlates with variables that we would expect it to correlate with. So for example, based on TVOTs, we would expect it to correlate with transportability. If you're engaging in these things to fulfill our needs, we should be transported. Again, straight from TVOTs, it correlates strongly with people's self-reported boundary expansion. It correlated with parasocial relationship with the character and parasocial relationships with the actor. So that was one of the other, these were two of the other scales that we were developing in this, because there's been a lot of controversy about parasocial relationship scales. Are they measuring PSR or are they measuring parasocial interaction? So we did that, and also self-reported narrative impact. So it seemed to be doing what we thought it should do. And so that was what we published in 2018, and we're very happy with that data. Now, the question was, are characters enough? Obviously, in the 2018 paper, that's what we were focused on, because the other two scales that we were developing and publishing that paper were on parasocial relationships. And so that's what we had the scale to focus on. But obviously, there are components of narratives besides the people. And will we engage in RII about these other components within a narrative, such as the events that happen? I may not change the characters at all, but can I change the events? And fundamentally, RII draws on memory. We're talking about asynchronous engagement with narratives. And so we're talking about, these have to be narratives that are stored and represented in memory. And so we decided to draw on Bucel and Balanzik's model of narrative comprehension. And the 4 graduate students from Michigan State were all involved with this research. So within the model of narrative engagement, comprehension engagement, they argue that narratives are represented in memory as nested mental models. And specifically, they talk about 3 categories of mental models that exist for narratives. And so we thought, well, maybe RII will reflect these three types of representation in memory. And the three types of models are character models, which we had already developed a scale for studying. Then event models, so our events for the situations that happen in the story as they unfold. And then Rick and Helena also hypothesized the story world, that larger world. So for example, when I'm watching or reading Lord of the Rings, that would be Middle Earth. And there are things that are constrained by that story world. So I would be shocked if Gandalf all at once were to pull out a cell phone and call somebody. That would violate the norms of that social world. And so those are the three types of representations that we felt, based on the evidence that's out there in Rick and Helena's model, that maybe people engage in RII about these. And so we conducted a second study, or we conducted a study, the first study for this group, where we were trying to expand the scale beyond simple characters. And so characters, we essentially kept the same scale from before. Then we added events. And so we asked questions like, one of the events in the story is different from the way the event occurred in the show. So we're asking them to change what, do you ever engage in that? Story universe. Imagine changing part of the world and thinking about how the world changed. Backstory. Backstory was something that Rick and Helena did not talk about, but when you look at fandom, a lot of the stories in fandom are beginning stories, origin stories, and that would be backstory. What did this character do before the story? What were the things that led up to the conflicts in the story, and so forth. And so we also added a scale for measuring backstory. And so, for example, to understand your favorite character in a story better, do you ever imagine the backstory with that character? And we carefully defined what we meant by backstory. And so we developed scales for all these items and wanted to see if we could validate this scale. And so we did an MTurk sample, because those are nice and cheap and easy. We had an expanded scale. We took the 8 items and added another 22 items to it, capturing these other 3 dimensions. We also measured need fulfillment, because we're drawing upon TBOTs. And if we were arguing that this is being done to fulfill need fulfillment, then we wanted to see if engaging in RII was related to any of these. And then we measured several different types of narrative engagement. And again, all of these were measuring as a trait. So in general, how much do you identify with characters? In general, how much are you transported, and so forth, to see what ones are related to RII. Are there particular types of stories we're more likely to engage in RII? And we're also interested in, what do people experience while they're engaging in RII? So we work very carefully with these to repurpose these scales for when you're thinking about the story later on. How much do you identify with characters? How much do you engage in parasocial relationships, and so forth? And so that's what we did in the study. So first of all, we found strong support for the expanded scale. So we found support for all 4 of these subdimensions of RII. And so we're very happy with that. We also, in terms of looking at need fulfillment, weren't as excited about these. I mean, we found that autonomy was related to all types of the RII, but relatedness and competence were not in this instance. We're going to have other data that will show different stories. But part of this, we also think, is that we're looking at this at the trait level. We're looking at RII as a trait. How often do you engage in this behavior? How often are you transported, and so forth? We also looked then at narrative engagement. And with narrative engagement, we had some interesting results there. First of all, as we'd expect from TBOTs, transportation was related to 3 of the 4 types of RII. Narrative impact was related to all 4 of the types of RII that we measured. Boundary was related to 3 of the 4. But what I found, and what we found particularly interesting and initially not anticipated, is that identification was negatively related with RII about the fictional universe. So that people who are identifying with characters tended not to want to RII about the fictional universe. But one of the things I would point out, with the way our scale is set up, we're asking them about changing the fictional universe. All of our items were about change. Okay, and so for people who identify with characters, they don't want to change the world. And we'll return to that. And then this is looking at narrative engagement while engaging with RII. And character III was related to identification, parasocial relationship, and then enthusiasm is how enthusiastic of a fan are you. Appreciation is your appreciation of this from the perspective of a fan, and then how much do you identify as a fan. And character III was related to all of these. Event RII was related to 3 of the 4. It was not related to appreciation. And again, story universe was negatively related to enthusiasm. And so people who had a lot of enthusiasm for the show, for being fans of the show, did not seem to want to RII or change the narrative universe. And finally, backstory was related to PSR, enthusiasm, and social identity. So in general, we took these results as fairly exciting. The fact that we developed this new scale and we're getting some new patterns with it, that people seem to be able to answer questions about what happens while you're engaging in RII, are you engaging in PSR, and so forth. But we had a couple of puzzling findings in there. And what those puzzling findings pointed us to was, as the graduate students pointed out to me, all of the questions that I had for the RII scales were about changing. And so I was changing characters, changing narrative events, changing the story world, because that's what I do. I'm the person who took Star Wars and combined it with Lord of the Rings. And so that's just the type of RII. But it was one of those things where, as a father, I was like, I probably should have thought more, because this is a picture of my 2 sons, and don't anyone tell them that I put this picture, and this is an ancient picture of them. This is years old, but this is them doing a scene from The Princess Bride. And my sons would do scenes perfectly from movies, have the dialogue down from a very young age. And so they weren't changing anything, but yet they were engaging in the story outside of watching the movie. So we would think about that sort of as a type of RII. And like we said, invested fans did not really they did not want to play with that story world. It seems like they wanted to keep that story world as it was. And so we started to think about, do we need to add another distinction? We've been measuring what we now call dynamic RII, but what about static RII? What about people who just want to recall favorite scenes from a movie? And I do that as well from time to time. I don't change everything, despite what my students may say about me. And so can we distinguish RII subscales for character, events, and fictional universe as involving changing the narrative, so that dynamic, or not changing the narrative, that static RII? And then the other thing we were interested in is backstory distinct for characters and events? We've sort of mushed those together in the earlier study, but people can go back and do the backstory for events, what led to the Gates of Mordor being created and so forth. So we want to understand those things. And Tolkien wrote many books to try to explain the backstory for the events that happened in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And so we wanted to see about that as well. So we wanted to get really complex. We wanted to essentially see if we could come up with a RII as a 3-order construct. So that we would have character, static, or dynamic. And an example of a static question, replay in your mind what one or more of the characters actually did in the story. We wanted to look at events the same way, static. Do you remember critical events in the story versus dynamic, which is what I gave you the question for that before. Story world, do you remember the story universe exactly as it was in the story versus do you change it? And then with backstory, we looked at backstory for characters versus events. And these are just example questions of both of those. And so we wanted to see what would happen with that. This one wasn't quite as clean as the last study, but we got some interesting findings, and we replicated those findings many times now. So we had 458 participants on MTurk. And we tested the RII as the 3rd-order construct using these 3 layers. And the initial CFA did not fit. It didn't fit at all. So we did exploratory EFA. And we eliminated items that were poor loading or items that cross-loaded. And what ended up happening is we lost the story world factor. And essentially what happened is those items in the story world factor, especially when we're looking at them statically, we're cross-loading with backstory. And so essentially the story world and the backstory we're combining, which at one level makes sense because both of those are looking at the broader story, the broader narrative. And this is the structure that we got. We got static RII for characters and events, dynamic RII for characters and events, and then backstory RII for characters and events. And we got this for this data set, which was looking at RII as a trait, and we've now replicated this, I think, 5 times. And so we're fairly confident with the structure. I've gotten very good replications of it. And the students on my team are very, very good at scale construction. And I'm so thankful for them being a part of it. And then also we looked at narrative engagement again in RII. So we're interested in those items. And again, we looked at transportation, and transportation was significantly related to all of those subscales, all 6 of those subscales. Interestingly, remember before we had identification was negatively related to the story world. People who identified with characters didn't want to change that world. Here, identification went along with the static character or not changing the character, and it was significantly related to the static event or not changing the events. So we're getting this to be a pattern in our data where identification really is, I am identifying with this character in this story, okay? And we think that's interesting. So conclusion at this point where we're at is that RII is very complex, and I have more data to talk about to further get at this. Narrative engagement, we think, across these studies has been clearly demonstrated to be related to RII. The more we're engaged in the narrative, when we first experience it, the more likely we are to engage in RII. And then we think it's very interesting about identification and no change. And this is a picture of Jonathan Cohen, who's a dear friend of mine and me at ICA only about a decade ago. And Jonathan Cohen's the person who's really made identification a part of our discipline. And one of the difficulties that Jonathan always faces is people will say, well, what's the difference between identification and transportation? What's the difference between identification and parasocial relationship? And what we think these data are very clearly pointing to is that identification is identifying with that character in this story. And we don't want it changed at all. When we change things, then we're probably beginning to talk more about parasocial relationships. But we really see this as identification is tied to this narrative, okay? Then what we're interested in is why do people engage in RII? Besides going on really boring vacations with your parents and you have nothing else to do, I don't think that's the only reason people engage in it. And going back to TBOTs, we're going to say for need fulfillment, and relief from managing the self, that RII gives us opportunities to do that when we can't normally engage with a narrative. So, I'm in the middle of, listening to this talk and you can't turn on a DVD, or maybe you can. And so you might start wondering about another movie or something like that. And RII can aid need fulfillment in 3 ways. First of all, just static engagement with a narrative that's already resulted in need fulfillment. So if I'm feeling out of control and I know there's a movie that really makes me feel in control of my life, I may start engaging in that and start reflecting on that movie to give me that sense of control again. I can also change the story to improve its ability to fulfill my needs. And so I may have a story that was really good, but if this and this had happened, it would be so much better. And so we can also dynamically change stories. And then interestingly, self-determination theory says simply engaging in dynamic RII, and they didn't talk about it as dynamic RII, but essentially simply engaging in counterfactual reasoning, imagining how things could be better or how they could be different should increase your competence. I mean, think about it. If I'm watching a Tarantino movie and I think about, if he had done this with the character instead of this, it would be a much better movie. It's like, that's got to make me feel competent if I feel I can improve on this great director. And that's the idea as well. So there are multiple ways in which RII can increase our need fulfillment. So the question was, are there any recent events that have been decreasing people's need fulfillment? And I asked that somewhat sarcastically because we've had a pandemic, and there was a fair amount, actually very early on, people were using self-determination theory to look at the pandemic And uniformly across a lot of data sets, you found that the more people were experiencing the pandemic, the greater their need fulfillment was being threatened. They had greater needs for fulfilling these needs. Because think about it, your autonomy was taken away. Your competence could be taken away. You couldn't control the virus. And oftentimes we weren't allowed to be around people that we wanted to be around with. And so relatedness was also threatened. And so we did a natural experiment. Purdue, so my colleagues at Purdue, was in-person classes the entire pandemic, where Michigan State went to online classes for over a year. We were online format only. And so the thinking was, Purdue, probably the students aren't suffering as much of a threat to their relationship needs as the students at Michigan State. And so we thought that Michigan State students might be experiencing more threats to their needs, and particularly relatedness needs. And so our predictions were that Michigan State would probably engage in more narrative media use, engage in more RII, engage in more parasocial, and both RII and parasocial relationships should be related to higher need satisfaction. Okay. And so what we did is we had 364 students pretty evenly split between the two universities. We had them name a narrative show and a character from that show that they had watched in the last week. And you'll notice this is a distinction from what we've done in the earlier studies. In the earlier studies, we've treated RII as a trait. We just ask in general. Now we're going to say identify a particular show, and we want to know that you watched last week and you RII'd about that show. And have you engaged in parasocial relationships with characters in that show? So we measured RII, parasocial relationships, and the need fulfillment, the three needs as outlined by self-determination theory. And then there are some people, such as Mary Beth Oliver, the president of CA, has also offered insight to that as well. So one of our needs is to feel that we have insight to things. Okay. I should have said a caveat before this. Our hunches about people at MSU feeling greater deprivation didn't hold up. So that didn't happen. But generally, people were in bad shape. But what we found is that retrospective imaginative and RII was highly related. So people who were engaging in more RII about the show they had watched last week had much higher fulfillment of their needs, much higher fulfillment of their competence needs, much higher fulfillment of their relatedness needs, and much higher fulfillment of their insight needs. All perfectly consistent with what TBOS would argue. Now, we can't argue, and nor do we want to argue, that this is a cause and effect relationship. I tend to be much more of a dynamic thinker. And so we think there's a dynamic going on here. But we saw this as very strong data for the idea that RII can play a role in need fulfillment, as did parasocial relationships. Parasocial relationships were related to relatedness, which is what we would expect. We'd also hypothesize it would be related to insight, and that relationship didn't happen. But again, we took these as very exciting data for why people engage in RII. That, like what TBOS argues, that we engage in stories to help with need fulfillment. That's our fundamental reason for seeking out narratives. That's the fundamental, or what we would argue is a basic reason why we engage in RII. Okay. One last set of data that I'll talk about, and I haven't gone into a lot of detail about the data, so I can give you a broader overview of what we've been looking at. So I hope that's okay. We're expanding here two ways in this next set of studies. The context for exploring RII. So in the early studies, we looked at it as a trait. And then in that last study with Purdue versus MSU students, we looked at a recently watched show. Now we're going to look at a franchise. And the first study we did was Star Wars. And these data are under review at HCR right now. And initially, we only submitted Star Wars. I can't blame reviewer 2. All 3 reviewers said, well, you need to do this more than just a Star Wars. So I had the reviewer 1, 2, and 3 problem, not just reviewer 2. And they wanted it in a different context. They wanted to see if the model held in other contexts. And so we also did The Office, which is a long-running sitcom in the both in England and the United States. And so both of them long-running, ones that had lots of fans. People could vary in their level of fandom, but the nature of the content was very different. And that's why we chose The Office as the second one that we did. So we also wanted to try to expand on this general framework. We're still developing the model for RII. And so this is still exploratory stuff. But we wanted to look at what we thought were traits that we could draw from both the Bucell and Belansek model and from TBOTS. And we thought need for cognition, just the general notion for thinking would be related to mental representations, curiosity, need for closure, for meaning would be related to insight, nostalgia would be related to relatedness, and emotional intelligence also with the characters. So these were some traits that we thought, drawing from TBOTS and the Bucell and Belansek model, that might be related. Then general entertainment experiences, and two of these we've already talked about, PSR and identification, we thought that they would be related. And then we were interested in hedonic and eudaimonic motivations, because those are beginning to play more of a role in how we think about TBOTS as well. So we wanted to look at those. And then content-specific experiences, so boundary expansion, which again is this whole concept from TBOTS, and then satisfaction with story resolution. And we sort of felt that, in the Bucell and Belansek model, in fact, actually in the 2006 paper, they talk about if you're dissatisfied with the story resolution, that's going to result in perceptions of realness or lack of realness and so forth. And so we thought that might also be related to that as well. So the sample was, we did again an MTurk sample for Star Wars, and the Star Wars we way oversampled because we did a split half. And so the first half of the participants, 482 of them, were used for model development. And then we replicated that model with the second half. And so I'm going to talk about 3 data sets, and 2 of those are with the Star Wars data. And then we're going to see again, can we replicate that model yet again with the Office? So we're using a very different type of media content. And that's what we're looking at here. Then the next figure I'm going to show you is going to blow your mind, and I apologize for it, but I'm just showing it to you to show you, essentially give you an overview for how we did the data. I'm not going to go through all 3 of these, but this would be if we were using it at the SCM. But essentially what we did is we used the variable and we used it to predict overall RII. If that happened, then we removed it from the model and looked at static, dynamic, or backstory. If it related to those, then we removed it and didn't look at it anymore. If it didn't relate to any of those, we looked at one of the 6 subtypes of RII. So that's the way we did this analysis. And I could show you all 3 figures. I decided there were just way too many numbers. And what I want to show you instead is this, because I think this is this is one of those things when we started to do this, I was really freaked out that there's no way in hell Office is going to replicate. But this is what we found. In relation to RII in general, we find that gender is unrelated, and we've never found gender effects. However, age is negatively related to RII. The older you get, the less you engage in RII. So I'm a real anomaly because I engage in RII all the time. Familiarity is positively related to RII, and that just seems like foundationally you have to have some familiarity with the show before you can engage in RII. Curiosity was positively related with RII across all 3 of these data sets. And this is one where I was like, oh no, that's not going to work for the Office. And the students were like, oh yeah, it is. It's related to this notion of exploring. Need for closure was related across all of them. Nostalgia proneness was one of the 2 that didn't replicate across them. We got nostalgia proneness when we initially developed the model. But it fell out with the model evaluation and it fell out with the Office. And it was a weak, it wasn't a strong relationship in the first one. PSR is related across all 3 of these data sets. Boundary expansion, I don't have the betas here, but boundary expansion is always the strongest prediction, which again comes straight from TBOTS, so we'd expect that. And then in relation to static RII, and so we're going to imagine the story the way it was. When we're really happy with the way the story came out, we're going to imagine it that way, which makes sense. We're happy with it. We're going to keep it that way. Identification to me is really interesting. This is just in relation to dynamic RII. And as we argued earlier, identification is negatively related to dynamic RII. When you identify with a character, you do not want to change that narrative. And that we keep finding that across the data sets. And we think this becomes a really strong, a very, very compelling. Jonathan's developed a lot of compelling arguments for why identification is distinct, but I think this provides more evidence for the distinction between identification and these other parts of narrative engagement. And then search for meaning was the other one. It was negatively related to static RII about events, in initial Star Wars, but then it wasn't significant later on. And this is one of those things where I think looking at it this way in particular is very powerful, because as media scholars, we want to see that models hold across different types of content. This was only two types of content. Obviously, we need to do a lot more research, but we were very excited with these results. And I have to be honest, I would have bet that we weren't going to get this much match. And we were very, very thrilled with this. Very, very excited with this. And this is the graduate students developed this model. And I think it's a good way for looking at RII. And hopefully you can see my cursor on here so I can talk about things. But essentially, we start off with story exposure, and that can be attention to the primary story. That can be paying attention to fan fiction and things like that. And that's where we're going to get that mental representation. Now, we're tying the mental representation to characters and to events, specifically about the story, and tying those in with need satisfaction, because we're finding that's a strong reason for why people engage in RII. Then we're going to retrieve these and engage in RII through, for boundary expansion, so I can satisfy my needs, for parasocial interaction, identification, some types of empathic responses. But what I also want to highlight, and over here, when we're engaging with that, we can engage in static RII, or we can engage in dynamic RII, where we're trying to improve or change the story in some way. But one of the things I want to highlight, and this is some of the work that we're going to start doing, and Jen Ho and I have a paper that just came out in the Journal of Media Psychology, where we argue this, but that when we're engaging in RII, we're then changing these representations. Even if we're engaging in static RII, we're strengthening those parts of the story that we re-engage in. And we think that is an important thing, and I'll talk about that in a minute, how we may be strengthening components of the story, making that representation stronger. And we think that may have implications for how we interpret later components of the story. So, where do we want to take this in the future? Well, one is obviously continuing to explore predictors of RII, but also wanting to explore consequences of RII. One of the consequences we've looked at is what we believe to be a consequence is need satisfaction. We actually have one of the students is doing that with her dissertation, where she's going to experimentally look at that. But other consequences might be things like, when we look at edutainment. Do people curse things that they see in medical dramas? There was an interesting thing when I was in high school, where there was this big increase in the number of people going to the emergency room for heart attacks in Chicago. And it was this one week where there's this big increase. There was not an increase in the number of people having heart attacks, but there was an increase in the number of people going in reporting they had the symptoms of heart attacks. And the hospital officials were baffled until somebody said, well, last weekend a main character in a main show had a heart attack. Obviously, people were thinking about these things. And so we think that may be another very interesting consequence of RII. What is the role of RII in fan behaviors? We expected there would be a role of RII in fan behaviors. So far, we're not finding it as much as we would think we would, but it's not, we've only been doing this sort of tangentially. But for example, if a person engages in LARPing, so I'm role-playing a character, is that RII or is it something else? We would like to think that RII is sort of the cognitive underpinnings of that, but we don't know. And then the thing I alluded to earlier is what is the role of RII in how future texts are read? So for example, with the 8th installment of Star Wars, a lot of serious fans were very upset with it because Luke was not a hero. He did not act in a heroic manner in the 8th Star Wars. He just sort of sat on this little planet and didn't do anything. But when you go back and you go through the earlier Star Wars, like the second Star Wars movie, it's sort of what Luke did in that movie as well. He wasn't heroic all the time. He was off chasing Yoda and trying to learn and things like that. He's never been the gung-ho Batman type hero. He's more reserved than that. But what we think may very well happen is if I'm going through and I'm engaging in RII about Star Wars, I want to focus on those parts where Luke is a hero. And if those those parts of the representation keep getting replayed and replayed, they're going to become stronger in that, and they're going to play a much stronger role in how we interpret later things. Likewise, when I engage in RII about Batman, I'm a huge Batman fan as well. Does how I engage in RII about Batman as the Dark Knight influence how I interpret future stories of Batman? And those are some questions that we're interested in studying. I'll be very honest, I don't have a clue how to study these yet, and I would love to, have other people take it and figure out ways to do it, or talk with people about how to do it. But that's something else we're also interested in. And the final thing that we've been talking about in the lab is RII only retrospective? That's the way we've talked about it, that we're going back and retrospecting on past stories. But part of what we were talking about, like when I'm engaged in an RII about Batman, I may be doing future actions. So for example, like I said, the original focus was on retrospection, but in the age of media convergence, we have asynchronous imaginative involvement about, it may be more asynchronous, it may be much more dynamic than just afterwards. So think about fan theories. Our fan theory is a type of RII where we're engaging in how we think this story is going to end, and we're predicting what's going to happen in the ending of the story. And I just want to have a little thought experiment for you. If you're big into film, this is something I just heard, okay? Harrison Ford and Leonardo DiCaprio are going to star in an upcoming Vietnam War movie directed by Quentin Tarantino. I've just heard that. I don't know if it's true or not. If you heard that, would you just, okay, that's fine? Or would you start engaging in things? Okay, thinking about Tarantino and the way Tarantino does things with films, Harrison Ford is always the good guy, but Tarantino always likes to throw things in people's face. So is Harrison Ford going to be a traitor? In other words, we start spinning out the story. And in fact, Art Rainey talks about that in affective disposition theory, that, when we see trailers and things like that, we're developing expectations for the story that's going to happen. And that's going to influence part of how entertaining we find that story. And what we're arguing is, in fact, that may be a type of RII that's going on there. But thank you very much for your attention. These worked. I got my little totems so I could keep away the evil spirits, and I think we kept good connection with everything.